Thank you again for joining today's webinar brought to you by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute and the National American Indian Court Judges Association. Today's webinar is titled Empowering Tribal Courts and Pro Se Criminal Defendants and will be presented by Ilsa Turner, Staff Attorney at the Nevada Legal Services, and Mary Rodriguez, Staff Attorney at the National American Indian Court Judges Association. I will now turn it over to Mary to introduce herself and to get us started.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Mary Rodriguez, and I'm a staff attorney at NIJA, or the National American Indian Court Judges Association. Next slide. I'm joined today by Ilsa Turner, who's the staff attorney at the Nevada Legal Services, Nevada Legal Services Organization. I've gotten to know Ilsa through a grant that we were working on called the Tribal Civil and Criminal Legal Aid Grant, the TCLA grant. NIJA was awarded this grant to help improve and provide training and technical assistance for tribal justice systems. That's one of the things that NIJA does. We are also an association comprised of tribal and state justice system personnel and others, including judges, peacemakers, court administrators, court clerks, practitioners, and scholars who are devoted to supporting and strengthening tribal justice systems through education, information sharing, and advocacy. Next slide. Today, Ilsa and I are going to be talking to you about pro se resources, a little about my background, and I will let Ilsa introduce herself at her sides, is that I am a former tribal public defender from Washington State. I did that for over 10 years in Washington State until I moved to California and became a program attorney at NIJA. One of the passions of mine is providing as much access to justice as I can for those who are experiencing or involved in the criminal justice system or in the civil legal aid arena. And one of those ways we can do that is sort of develop and help enhance and implement pro se resources within tribal communities. So we'll start with the pro se basics, and then we'll go into Ilsa's presentation, which is about Nevada Legal Services and all of the tangible, amazing work that they have done on developing their pro se resources programs. And my favorite part about it is that she's able to provide you real world examples to get you started with your own pro se resources development. She's also going to share some examples of the work that she has done, including a pro se packet that she developed for one of the tribal communities that she works in. Next slide. So pro se resources, also a term that we call self-help. Other words that we've used is do-it-yourself, DIY, or how-to. In Latin, it means on one own's behalf. So you may decide that when you're developing these for your community, it might make sense to not call them pro se, since that is a word that is not something you hear in everyday language. That legalese can be a little confusing. So if you want to call it a self-help, do-it-yourself, a guide, a handbook, that might be a better idea in terms of reaching the community that you need to. There are lots of types of pro se resources, and part of this presentation will help you understand where's a good place to start and where you may be comfortable in your journey in starting pro se resources. Some of those may be information sharing and repositories. So in some communities I've worked in, they may have a form bank, which would explain, here are all our forms, and here's what we have as examples of those forms. And that may be a very simple place to start. You may have one blank motion form, and you might have like just a PDF copied out example of what that motion looks like printed, or that motion looks like filled out. It can be as simple as something like that, which maybe you don't think is very technical, but somebody who's filling out this blank form or this blank motion might find that to be helpful, that there's like an example of 2 sentences go here, your name goes here. Back to the information sharing, this may look like just a list of the things that are available for your tribal court or for your community. And that list may include instructions and explanations. So a lot of times our forms in tribal courts or tribal justice systems might be confusing just by the name of the form, like a motion in limine. If you are not an attorney, a motion in limine may be very confusing because in limine is a Latin term. Um, the instructions and explanations, and Ilse will give a great example of this, but sometimes these instructions and explanations can be very straightforward. They don't have to be scholarly. They can just be step one, step two, explaining what each of these things look like. When you start going through maybe your current form big, so if you have a blank motion, just a very simple blank motion, when you start developing your instructions and your explanations, you may find that you can get more detailed as you go through these. You may have one set of just, here is how you fill out a motion. And as you develop your pro se resources, you might start having explanations or instructions that are like, here is how you fill out a blank motion for an ICW case. Here is how you fill out a blank motion for a protection order case. And you might be able to develop these explanations and instructions as you go along, but it may be very simple at the beginning. It may be just a straight, here's how you fill out a blank motion. As you start developing these, you may realize that your motion forms are complicated, and it might encourage you to simplify the form for folks who are going through court unrepresented. When you're explaining, please explain, why are you here today, is maybe a better way to say, I am presenting this motion because, you might have a question underneath. What would you like to happen in this hearing? It's really simplifying it out for somebody who isn't an attorney or who's unrepresented in court. Sometimes we try to make things so, in line with what might be an example in a state court or in the county, and we end up making things very confusing for our community. And in the end, we're not really serving the community that we have the justice system in place for. And a lot of times when things become confusing and you don't have representation, and it doesn't look like you're going to have representation. So, right, like this is something that's been a problem for a while. Maybe the best way to go about that is to simplify the forms or provide instructions or explanations that make it easier. So at the end of the day, we realize that if things aren't explained in a way for somebody who doesn't have an attorney, you end up spending a lot more time in court, coming back, having another hearing, multiple hearings. And it's just not, it doesn't really provide, or it doesn't really spend the time that you want solving the problem. The other thing is, oftentimes it becomes hard to differentiate whose job, if anyone's job it is, to provide those instructions and explanations. So your tribal court judge might not feel comfortable explaining those things to somebody who's not represented. So if you can have those explanations or instructions in advance, it might make some of those problems that come up in hearings later easier to navigate. Guidebooks and handbooks. So these are a bit more of an undertaking, but they are things that you are currently doing in your practice. So if you start with a guidebook that's like representing yourself in tribal court or filling out forms in tribal courts, you're able to maybe maximize the amount of instructions or guides you have, and you can put together a guidebook or a handbook that you would be able to refer the person who's representing themselves to. I also find when you have all of those things in one place, it does put some ownership on the person who is seeking the help, right? They have to like get intense with the guidebook or the handbook. They got to look through and see, is this what I'm looking for? Nope, move on to the next page. And they're educating themselves at the same time about what they're really looking for. Drop-in clinics. So Nevada Legal Services and other of our legal services organizations do drop-in clinics. Those may be where a civil legal aid organization comes to your reservation and provides a clinic to help with certain specific legal aid needs. This may be in partnership with a legal aid organization, or you might be able to do one yourself. So even if you aren't an attorney or you don't have a bunch of attorneys at your disposal, you could provide a drop-in clinic that's like the basics of court forms, and your court administration or your tribal court clerks or even your tribal court judge could be available at that clinic to just sort of explain some of the formats of the courts. You can do that in one-on-one. You could do that with PowerPoint presentations, but it is a way to sort of get a bunch of people through the door who might seek this help all at once. And also it puts some ownership on the person to come to that clinic to get the help that they need. That kind of falls in lines with education and classes, offering classes or education to familiarize people who are coming through your tribal justice system who may need help with that program. So if they are representing themselves in an Indian child welfare matter, it might be a good idea if your community was able to hold, or even the department could hold a class on what is Indian child welfare. What does a case look like going through our tribal court system? What are some of the things that would be helpful for somebody who's going through the system to know so that when they are in court, and they're faced with all of these sort of confusing things, they have a bit of a background of what to expect when that happens. A lot of this does require work on the end of the administrators, on the end of the tribal justice system. And so this webinar is really just trying to help lay a foundation on where's a place to start and what is tangible and doable with the resources that you have. So we understand there's a lot going on in your life at all the times if you are behind the scenes in our tribal justice system. And so we're trying to find ways where you are already maybe doing these things, or doing things in a way that you can start repeating them so that further down the road, you have this guidebook or this bank or these instructions, and you can continue building on those as time goes on. Next slide. So this is just a question for folks that you can answer in chat and we'll just pay attention to. But does your tribal court offer any current pro se or self-help resources? If somebody comes into your court and they do not have an attorney, but they are going to be involved in a court proceeding, does your court currently offer them any resources? And it's okay to say yes or no in the chat too if you don't want to explain. Because I think too, after I went through some of those pro se resources, you might have realized like, actually, we do have some resources that we already offer, even though you might not have thought that your tribal court was offering them. So there is folks that have developed things without really realizing that all those explanations, all those instructions, all maybe the resource list you give out to someone else, that's considered a pro se resource. So I think the point of this question was to acknowledge that some of this work has been done. You might not just think of it in the way that is like a self-help resource, or some of it you're very close to developing, you just haven't formalized it. Next slide. So where to start? This is a question that's come up a lot with working in some tribal communities is I don't even know where to begin. There's so many folks who need help, and there's such a breadth of legal issues that folks need help with. In my experience as a tribal public defender, I would work in small tribal communities, and I was the only public defender. If I had a conflict, so I could not represent someone because maybe the victim in their case was somebody that I had represented previously, I would have to conflict out and that person would go without an attorney. And I know this is a problem in a lot of tribal communities, especially small ones with one public defender. So I always felt like while I am conflicted out and cannot help this person, it feels like because I can't help them, no one can help them. And so I always in this current job that I have, that's like a big need and passion of mine, is to find out how we can help folks who are unrepresented. And one of the best ways to think about that is to listen to the community to identify their biggest needs. So, in a case similar to that, if somebody's going unrepresented, what are the types of cases where I inherently will have a conflict in, right? So, a lot of times those are where there's a victim. So, maybe it's like a domestic violence type case. So, when I was thinking of what's a pro se resource that folks really needed in that tribal community, one was help with domestic violence cases, because that person was going unrepresented, so they didn't have an attorney. And in those cases that are very, very complicated, the court would spend, continuance, pretrial continuance after continuance after continuance, because they would involve, potentially, if there was children, the Indian Child Welfare Department. If there was a protection order, it would involve the protection order. You would have to deal with visitation if the parents were still together. And so there was just a lot of things that I was very concerned about. And we're like, how can we work on providing these resources for the person who's unrepresented? And in that case, in that tribal community, a lot of it had to do with domestic violence. So making sure there was a domestic violence victims advocate who understood that when there's somebody who doesn't have an attorney, we're going to have all of these issues, and that these types of events are going to come up without an attorney. And how can we work on those to provide the least conflict, the least amount of conflict as possible in those high conflict cases? Other ways you can listen to your community. Every time somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I have a problem and I need help with this," writing it down, even if it's just like tally marks that, okay, this is the 10th person who has said they need help with ABC, and starting to identify that maybe that's the biggest need and that's where we should focus on. Discuss with your court staff and your partners. So not just the internal tribal justice system court staff, but talk to the other departments that come into the court, right? So is housing seeing a big need? Are we seeing a lot of folks go unrepresented in other departments who are having hearings? And is there a way we can help provide or like guide pro se resources or self-help resources so that folks have some way to reach out? If you're new to it, start small, start very, very small. Take one thing at a time, take one area at a time. It's really easy to get overwhelmed and want to tackle like every form under the sun, or to tackle, one really big like, so Indian child welfare cases, you want to tackle all of those forms, and maybe we just start small with one. If your tribal court is well established in pro se resources, to say you have the guidebook, your website is up, you can download your forms, you have instructions. Congratulations, I'm very proud of you. Let us know. We'd all like to take a look at it and share those resources and show other tribal justice systems the work you've done. Be proud of that. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's share the successes that we've had. But do you need a refresh? Has somebody taken a look at those recently? And again, starting small and taking it one step at a time. The other thing with your improvement is that has the tribal code changed since you last had established those pro se resources? Have you had any new code changes? Have you had any new laws? Have things changed to where maybe those forms have changed and those instructions and guidance have changed as well? Next slide. Some basic civil pro se resources. When you think about, let's tackle and take a look at what we can provide for civil specific pro se resources, ask yourself what type of civil hearings are heard in your tribal court. A lot of times you think of the major ones and maybe you don't think about the minor ones that your clients or people are experiencing at the same time. What type of departments does your tribe have? So are those departments showing up to court hearings? Are they being involved in the court hearings? Do they have folks that maybe need the resources that never make it to the court hearing, that are dealt with outside of the court hearing, that are still involved in the process, but just didn't get to court and could still use some sort of pro se resources to help explain or help guide them when they're going through those conflicts in those departments? You have different levels of your self-help resources. So there's definitely the on-reservation resources you can provide. Um, One way to do that is to think about the departments that your tribe has. If you think of what's available for the folks that are having are justice involved, what are the programs that are offered for each person that is justice involved? Could some of these questions that they have, could you refer them on reservation to a tribal department that may be able to help them with that? One tribal community I worked for had a job vocation department. And I was so surprised that the vocation job department was able to help with certain things that I just didn't realize was part under their umbrella. And that could include getting your driver's license, getting the documents you would need to uh, get a job were also documents you needed for the other cases that they were involved in, and the tribe would provide help for that person to go get it, which also included like transportation to the driver's license place, just things that I like didn't realize were available on reservation. And Ilsa will have some good ways to, sort of think these through, because it's a lot for one person to kind of discover what's available off reservation. We do have some amazing legal aid organizations. Some of them do have programs for Alaska Native or Native American specific clients. So you may look at what's available under that umbrella. You have the city or county legal aid organizations, and you also have state legal aid organizations. Sometimes contacting all of those is a way to figure out what's available in your community. If you are a small community, um, there can be a lot of resources outside of that community, but it does take some reaching out to figure out what is there. I do have an example of there was a civil legal aid organization in Washington, Northwest Justice Project, and they did have an Alaska Native American specific unit that did a bunch of work in tribal communities. And I would refer clients there for things that I knew that they could help with, but it did involve my client following up with that organization. And a lot of times that wouldn't happen. So getting to know your legal aid organization so that you could call that attorney that's there and say, hey, did Joe call you? Because I told him multiple times, so that at least when Joe hasn't called, you can say, hey, Joe, look, I got this attorney here. They're going to help you. You just need to reach out. Next slide, please. Criminal specific pro se resources. So this is when your tribe doesn't provide a public defender, or they have an indigency standard that not everyone meets. So maybe you need to be low income and they make a little bit more than low income, so they don't qualify for the public defender. This is where my example, where you only have one public defender and they conflict out, or they choose to not use the public defender and go at it alone. So figuring out in these criminal specific ways of, is there forms, is there a guidebook, is there a way we can do this so that somebody who goes through unrepresented has an idea of what that looks like. There's a lot of resources online in terms of like what does your case look like when it goes through the criminal justice system. So maybe it's a good idea for you to provide, you don't necessarily have to provide a video, but like you could provide and Ilsa will show you sort of like a flow chart of what it looks like for your case to go through the criminal tribal justice system. A lot of times people don't understand timelines, or what is a pretrial? What do I have to do at a pretrial? What is a trial readiness? All of those sort of things that could be explained. And a lot of this information is online, but maybe you can customize it for your tribal court. Next slide, please. We also have non-legal specific pro se resources. So identification. How do folks go about getting identification, their benefits? Do they need things signed by notary, power of attorney? These are resources that you may be able to list. These are resources you may be able to accomplish on reservation in tribal departments. A lot of times there are things that you don't necessarily think about in terms of pro se resources because you're obviously thinking of like civil and criminal, but there are non-legal resources that a lot of folks are looking help for, and it's possible that these can be resolved or thought about when you're thinking about what's available in your self-help, what you can offer for your self-help. Next slide. In terms of pro se resources, why are they important? Um, there's a lot of reasons why they're important. The big one is justice and fairness. Obviously, the point of the justice system is that it is supposed to be just. Things are supposed to be fair. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. But providing access to justice by providing these resources, it gives folks a leg up on taking accountability, on being able to solve some of their problems. A lot of times you're just not in the tribal criminal justice system for the crime that is alleged you committed, right? There's so much other things going on. And also we'll talk about holistic defense, but essentially there's always things that folks will need help with that might not just be this crime or this civil legal aid issue, right? There's a lot going on. And if we can get the people who need that help access to those resources, we are helping heal them. We're helping heal the community. We're helping, hopefully, that this doesn't happen again in the future, or that some of the bad things that go along with it are mitigated or lessened, or a lesson is learned, or for their future generations, some of this they're able to teach, like, oh, I figured this out because of these resources I had access to. Time, resources, money, all of that is important. While you may not be able, your tribe might not be able to have a public defender, they're expensive. There's not a lot of resources or, certain amount of time that needs to be spent on this. At the end of the day, if somebody's coming to court and they're coming in 8 times and it's always the same thing, like, I didn't know that, or I didn't have that filled out, or I need more time, maybe providing some sort of clinic or providing a resource that they're able to get some of those questions answers actually will save you time in the long run, and cost less money in the long run because your staff isn't spending time answering these questions or saying, like, I can't help you, I don't have the answers to those questions. Partnerships and community resources. This one's huge, especially now in this time. It's helpful if there are folks who are doing the work that you are partnering with those folks, that they know your community needs the help and that you're able to access resources that they may be using in other communities, for your tribal community. Really establishing those partnerships and learning what's available in your community. A lot of times when you do the resource mapping that Ilsa will talk about, you find agencies and organizations doing work that, like, you had no idea was happening. And being able to have that knowledge and potentially provide those resources to your community is a wonderful idea. And that can be accomplished by really reaching out and figuring out who's doing what in your community and your surrounding community. Next slide.
Mary,
Yeah.
before we move on, we do have a question in the chat. And I wanted to get some clarification for that, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. The question is, in rural Alaska, specifically when on an island, I think they're asking, can the tribe support with funds to support the pro se defendant or person with airfare, hotel, etc., to attend court in another place, like Juneau, for example?
So I think I am not that knowledgeable in rural Alaska, but I do think that there are agencies that may have the ability to provide for that. If you are in a rural Alaska, tribe and you have a court case that's in Juneau that requires you to be in all of these places, then there's probably other people who have had those same issues. And I would assume that there's hopefully a solution or somebody who's gone through this. So, like, your Alaska Legal Services Corporation may have some ideas on how to get that person to that tribal court. Other ways we know, and maybe not Alaska as an example, but starting to have conversations with the court and the tribal community that's like, hey, we have folks who need to get there and they can't get there because it costs this much money for them to get there. So how can we solve this problem that doesn't require us spending this much money or them having out of pocket to spend this much money? Is this something we can do via mail? Is this something we can file motions via mail? If you have access to the internet, which I know is difficult in rural Alaska, but could we do this over Zoom? Could we do this where we can resolve this problem that doesn't require in-person appearances? Because we are now in a world where we realize that's possible, right? We could do Zoom court, we could figure that out. So let's start talking about how we can make that happen. And when you get your tribe involved and say, hey, so and so wants to take responsibility and they would like to go to Juneau for this court case. Let's add up how much this is going to cost either A, the person if they are individually responsible, B, if the tribe is willing to provide some of that money, how much that would cost, or C, if the state is on the hook for that, how much that costs. And when you start looking at those numbers, you're like, this is costing $5,000 for this one trip. Is there a way we can use that $5,000 for something different? Right? Could we use that $5,000 to establish our own tribal court, like, or our own Zoom, or our own broadband, or whatever that might look like? And it's those conversations where we start really talking about access to justice, because it isn't fair for that person to have to make all that trip and spend that money to get there to do this solve whatever problem is. And if it's child custody, that you want to encourage them to be there for that they're trying to be a part of their child's life in a way that we should always encourage. And when we have all these barriers or these roadblocks, that's really when we start talking about, like, what is our impact and how can we change sort of the status quo so that these things can happen in a way that's really sustainable. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to get that many people going to child custody cases if it's $5,000 one way or round trip to get to that court hearing, right? I'd love to talk more about it because I have lots of ideas. I don't live in Alaska, but I really think starting these conversations is where that happens. Because when you start thinking about, like, why do we do the things why do we do the things the way we do them? We're starting to realize they don't always have to be like that. If the end game is different, if the end game is like we want the families to be together, then maybe we need to start providing these resources for the families where they're at instead of, far away that costs a lot of money to transport. One thing Alaska, and I would highlight this, one thing Alaska Legal Services Corporation is working on in Alaska is the Community Justice Worker Program, which is the idea of, in places where you're not going to be able to have attorneys because they're rural or they have limited access, and there's a bunch of tribes in Alaska that have very different locations, starting to provide community justice workers, training for community justice workers who are folks who will do some of the legal work, and they're not attorneys. They are looked over by, they're managed by attorneys. So they're not just out there on their own. But the idea is they live in the community. So you would have a person who's a part of your tribal community who could do some of the justice work that an attorney that would usually do. And it's a really interesting program. I think Nija's going to do a podcast, I believe, discussing community justice workers. But Alaska is doing a lot of really amazing work. And a lot of the states are looking towards Alaska in this community justice worker movement to provide some of these access to justice, to provide some of these resources in terms of access to justice. Next slide. So at this point, I will hand it over to Ilsa Turner, who can introduce herself. Thank you, Ilsa.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. As it's been alluded to, my name is Elsa Turner. I'm a staff attorney here at Nevada Legal Services. I work in our Indian Law Project, one of our areas of practice here highlighted on the slide. The overarching mission of Nevada Legal Services is to strengthen communities by ensuring fairness and providing equal access to justice for low-income Nevadans. So that's all Nevadans, right? It's not just people that live in Reno. It's not just people that live in Vegas. It's everyone throughout the state. So we do everything for everyone. Here's all of our areas of practice. We might even be missing a few. We do so much. But today we're really going to focus on the Indian Law Project where I work. And just before we get started, I do want to highlight to the last question that Holly Reynolds put in the chat that Alaska Native Justice Center does provide pro se clinics. So for those of you maybe looking for some resources out in Alaska, we have people in the chat that are ready to go for it. Additionally, I'm here presenting today, but none of this would be possible without the team I've been working with for the past 2 years, specifically Ty Morley and Alexandra Rawlings. They've been instrumental in this. I'm just kind of the person they push forward to come and talk about it. So, yep, we're going to get started. And if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to answer them as I see them and we have a natural break. So next slide, please. So this is a little bit more about the project I specifically work in. We can work with all of the tribes here in Nevada, but we only go when a tribe requests us to come and work with them. I'm not just going to show up at a tribal doorstep and say, I'm here to provide free legal services, take them or leave them. So we kind of wait for that invitation before we start working with the community. So we provide free civil and criminal help for communities that need it. We have had active public defender contracts in tribal communities, and we also travel directly to geographically isolated communities that may have more limited access to services. So if there is issues with internet connection or maybe transportation issues, we'll just go directly to those communities so they don't have to try to get a hold of us. Next slide. So a couple of years ago, NYJA came to Nevada Legal Services and said, hey, let's work together on this thing called holistic defense. And everyone kind of looked at each other and said, well, what's holistic defense? What are you talking about? Because, in a traditional law school education, they're like, you have your defenders and you get them out of their criminal case and you're done. But NYJA came to us and said, no, holistic defense is this really cool thing where we recognize that, yes, somebody may have a legal issue going on, but they also probably have social issues that are impacting their representation in the criminal justice system. So it was more so this idea that we should treat the whole problem the person's having, not just one issue. So to be truly effective advocates, we felt that our work needed to be broad. We needed to include penalties people were experiencing, life issues people were experiencing, and look at the legal and non-legal issues. So for instance, if we have a person that's on their 5th driving with no license, we go to that person and we say, hey man, why don't you have a license? And sometimes the answer was truly as simple as, well, I don't have my birth certificate. I can't go get a license. And really what they needed was somebody to sit down and say, well, let's order you a birth certificate and go get you a license. And that was all that had to be done. And then they, weirdly enough, stopped getting driving without license tickets. But we've really modeled ourselves off of the Bronx Defenders, which was then continued into the work of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Their holistic defense work they're doing at the tribe is mind-blowing. Sometimes I just go and look around on their website just to kind of see what they're working on, what they're doing, and the really positive impacts it's had for their tribal communities. I really encourage everyone to look at it and check it out if you have time. I've gone ahead and linked it here for you, and it's been put in the chat. Thank you so much. So everyone can kind of look at that and kind of get an idea of maybe something you could do in your own community, and kind of not reinvent the wheel, just kind of take the wheel and put your name on it. So next slide. So tribal holistic defense really has 4 pillars. It's the seamless access to services for not just a client's legal needs, but all of their needs. Sometimes this looks like a multidisciplinary team where we all sit down together and we say, hey, John Smith, he needs a license, so he needs his birth certificate, and he needs some assistance finding a job. Can anyone help him with that? And we say, okay, person in this department's going to work with that, and you're going to work on this. So that goes into our kind of our next pillar where we talk about the dynamic interdisciplinary communication. So we're talking as a team, right? We're all coming together and we're saying, we're not going to make it so you can't get John's information and you can't know this about John, because we're all coming together to say, we want John to have a better outcome. And oftentimes it's really great when we have advocates that have not only interdisciplinary skills, so maybe we have an attorney on the case that has a social work background, or we have a tribal council member assisting us that used to work in tribal housing, right? But we also want people that are culturally competent to the issues that we're working on with their communities, because coming in and saying, well, this is the way it is, this is the way you have to do it, this is the way that this other group works it, and it doesn't work for that person, kind of really sets that person back and doesn't help us move forward towards our goal. And then, of course, there's a building of trust through robust understanding with the tribal communities. For us, a lot of that looked like going and talking to tribal communities and saying, does this work? And when tribal communities said, no, that doesn't work, here's why, saying thank you and changing what we were doing to more so meet the communities. We can go to the next slide. So there is currently a holistic defense pilot project that Mary alluded to a little bit. There's Alaska Legal Services, Oklahoma Indian Legal Services, and my office. I'm big fans of Alaska Legal Services and Oklahoma Indian Legal Services. Every time I see them at conferences, I kind of fangirl, and I'm kind of like, well, what are you guys working on right now? Feel free to let me know. So all of us have been working on incorporating holistic defense into criminal representation and certain civil representation, because I think we're all also aware that you can have a civil issue that really is predicated on underlying personal issues, right? Like, okay, so maybe this person has an issue such as eviction, but why are they being evicted? Is it an issue of they need help getting another job? Or is it an issue of they're out of work or their kids have been sick and they don't have the license? So looking at things like that. So we also are working on fostering the development of interdisciplinary skills. So when people contact my office, for instance, and say, hey, can we have those forms you made? Yeah, here, take them. I don't put your name on them, put your tribe's name on them, take them. I don't care. And we also freely share a resource list with people just to make sure that all that information is out there. We don't want to hold on to that information. I don't want the keys to that kingdom. I want everyone to have that information. And then we've also been identifying gaps, be it in social settings or legal settings, and then kind of changing our practice to meet those gaps. We can go to the next slide. So this is specifically what Nevada Legal Services goals with holistic defense were. We wanted to address the lack of capacity. You'll see capacity is blue, that links to a Native American Rights Foundation article about the Tribal Law and Order Act and how it improves certain things, but then there wasn't necessarily great funding for other things and the other issues there may be that tribes may be dealing with. And then we wanted to increase access to services, and not just legal services, but we wanted to make sure people had access to social workers, they had access to housing, they had access to other civil supports that they may need. Also, Nevada Legal Services has the issue that I think a lot of communities have, and Mary discussed earlier, where we were one of the few people that could be called to do criminal defense representation. We're very lucky in Nevada that we have really, really great tribal court advocates. I saw someone discussing in the chat earlier, lay advocates, and we're very lucky that those awesome intelligent advocates are working with us. But then there also becomes the issue of sometimes people can't afford an advocate, sometimes that advocate also may be conflicted out, things of that nature. So we wanted to create something that wasn't just, okay, well, try calling this person and see what they say. So we created a conflict guide and then ultimately the pro se packet. And then we've been partnering with service providers who can remotely meet with our clients. So maybe our clients don't have to drive all the way to Reno to get something like a mental health assessment. Next slide. And the Taloa piece I just spoke about is now in the chat. So this is kind of what building on holistic defense looks like. It's establishing a presence within the community. So again, being a part of the community, not just showing up one day and saying, hey, I have this idea, take it or leave it. We want to involve all parts of the legal system. So that's law students that may be able to help, tribal court clerks, the judiciary, judges, tribal court administrators. We're building those bridges from urban to rural. Like I said, we have 2 big cities in Nevada. We have Reno, which is kind of a big city. And then we have Las Vegas, of course. But then, what do we do about our clients that live in Winnemucca or that live in Ely, that live in, Fort McDermott, to kind of bridge the gap to make sure they have just as great of access. We looked into who our high need populations were, so where we were seeing a lot of these common issues. Non-traditional partnerships, so we've partnered with universities, we've partnered with different nonprofits, we've asked other tribes if they would help with other tribal memberships. So it's just thinking creatively, and then also working on technology issues, getting more devices to people, getting better internet access to people, and then working together as a community with the tribe by everyone having a seat at the table to discuss the issues. We can go to the next slide. So here's kind of our steps we took. Obviously this is what worked for us. It may not work for your tribe. It may not work for the community you work in, but this is kind of just an idea. So we started off by working with our local university. They have a social work school, and they said, hey, we'll send you some social workers if you'll teach them and give them field experience. And we said, great, perfect. We need in-office social workers to help us with the collateral issues our clients are facing. They did a lot of the resource mapping help for us, and it was really great to work with them, and we continue to work with them. We also started looking at our different files we had to see, okay, again, this person has had 5 driving without a license tickets. Why don't they have a license? And we started looking for common issues that people were having so we could begin to work on tackling those. And then we started at a small level and kind of went big. So first we looked at where Fort McDermott had a lot of resources after we identified Fort McDermott as the tribe we wanted to work with. So we looked at what resources they had, and then we kind of collaborated with state tribal resources. So things like the Nevada Urban Indians group, ITCN, which is the Intertribal Council of Nevada. And then we looked at state resources that are available to tribal members to fit their needs. And then we drafted a resource map that we can chunk out to give to clients. Because I think the entire resource map is over 15 pages at this point, but not everyone reads 15 pages. And if you handed me a packet that was 15 pages and said, hey, figure it out, that's not helpful to me. So we've been chunking it out and giving it to people who are saying, I need help making sure that I have money to go back to school, and I need help getting daycare for my kids. And then we can chunk it out and give it to people. We can go to the next slide. So this is kind of what something could look like that we would give to somebody. So we have, Head Start on there, Nevada Urban Indians, and additional attorneys and lay advocates that we can refer people to. This is not everyone that we have that we can refer people to. This is kind of just what fit on the slide today, but you can really make these resource maps really long once you start looking into your communities. We can go to the next slide. So I think we're kind of going to gloss over this resource mapping activity. It's more just of a thinking exercise in the interest of time. All of these slides will be sent out to everyone, so you can all think about it on your own time. But this is kind of to suggest to people to look at maybe other tribal resources as well as local and state resources that are available. We can go to the next slide. So again, these are just kind of some thinking questions with the previous activity for folks to think about when thinking about doing their own resource mapping. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is something Mary talked about a little bit earlier in providing a resource to perhaps criminal defendants that kind of explains what the criminal case looks like and where their case is going to go. So this is actually from the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe here in Northern Nevada. They have this resource on their website. They also have a lot of great other resources on their website if anyone's interested in looking at their website. But this is something they have just straight on their court page. You click on the court page and it's right there. So everyone has access to it, everyone can think about it and kind of know where they are in their process. We can click to the next slide. This is one I kind of made just very simply for when we were doing a lot of work at Fort McDermott. I have this as a Word document on my laptop, more than happy to send it out to everyone after this. So you can just change some information around, delete a couple things, and have it available for your own tribal membership or the communities that you're working in. We can go to the next slide. So Nevada Legal Services worked with the Fort McDermott tribe on creating what we called a pro se packet, so a self-representation packet. We specifically focused on order to show cause because we saw a lot of membership dealing with that. So an order to show cause is just a fancy way of the court asking you to come and explain yourself. So of course, our first step was to determine if there is a need and if the tribe was interested, because again, you don't want to just show up somewhere and say, take this, take it now. And then we collaborate on the legal issue. So we come to the court, we say, hey, we've noticed this. What have you noticed? And they say, well, we've noticed this. So we say, great. Can we work on this together? It's also great to speak to community members. There was a lot of elders that worked with us and community members that worked with us to help create this. They were integral in this. I don't think we would have made, frankly, anything without the community members and elders helping us. We do one legal issue per packet. We just think it's a little easier. Otherwise, it gets a little lengthy, but obviously you do what's best for you. The next step would be to look to your code. I know when we looked at the code, even I, as an attorney, was like, gosh, what does that mean? I hope I figured that out. So we kind of included some non-legal language that meant the same thing, just so it was more approachable. You're also going to want to look to your code for formatting things and infographic info to create one. And again, we don't just release this willy-nilly out into the wild. We bring it back to the membership and community partners to say, hey, does this look okay? Like, is there anything you would change? And then once we have everybody on board, we go ahead and release it. We can go to the next slide. So this is just what's in our pro se packet for an order to show cause. Again, this is kind of just an example for everyone. You don't have to do it this way. You can kind of change things out. And yes, we will send an email as to what the pro se packet looks like. I can send it to everyone as a Word doc. So if you want, you can just take the bones of it and customize it to your needs. So yep, this is just everything we have in there. And we can go to the next slide. A big one that we've included that has been a pretty popular one with our tribal court clerks and tribal court administrators is this paper that says what the court clerk can and cannot provide to people. I think there's oftentimes maybe some confusion in tribal court that's like, well, you're here at the court, can you answer my question? And that put a lot of our court clerks and tribal court administrators in a tough spot. So we've included this just to be clear for everyone utilizing the pro se packets. We can go to the next slide. So this is the big example of what an order to show cause response form looks like. We have everything numbered with a corresponding specific direction. And again, we'll email all of this to you. And so the specific directions tells people this is what you should include generally, right? An instance as to why you might have been absent or not responded. Do you plan to include evidence? Things of that nature, just so tribal membership is a little bit more guided in how to fill this form out. We can go to the next slide. So then we also include a completed example for people to look at. And it's just an honest example, right? People can just say, I didn't come to my last court date. That's why there's a motion for an order to show cause out. And then we give them space to explain, my son was sick, he had the stomach flu, and I need to take him to the doctor. And these are things that people can tell the court, but oftentimes court is so charged and so electric that people may get nervous, they may get scared, they may forget things. This is also a great way for people to have time to collect their thoughts. Then we can go to the next slide. So then we also created, yes, Holly, we will include what the court clerk can and cannot do. So this is an example of some of the evidence we have people include. So, if you had to take your child to the doctor and that's why you missed out on court, you can include that. We also give an example of maybe providing text messages between you and a person that was kind of keeping an eye on your other kids while all this was going on. So that's pretty broad overview of everything we have in the Pro Se packet. It will, of course, be emailed to everyone. My contact information is on one of the slides at the end, I believe. You're always more than welcome to email me with questions. I understand that it can be scary, but I promise, it's one foot in front of the other and you can get it done. Additionally, I want to encourage folks, there's been a lot of great people in this chat sharing that their tribe really has great examples that you can look to. And, building that community with other tribal communities, maybe even if they're not close to you, you can still say, hey, I saw you in the chat and you said you had this. Can we talk about it? That's always a great way too to work on holistic defense and pro se resources. And I just want to add as kind of a final note that this may seem like a Herculean undertaking, but you can do smaller steps in this process, right? So you can just put up a flyer that says, this is the number to tribal housing. This is the number to the local legal resources. This is the court schedule, right? Or you can just put up the court clerk can and cannots. And that's just a great way to start on your holistic defense and pro se resources. So I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so do we have any questions for Mary, myself?
Thanks, Ilsa. I'm currently not seeing anything, so if anybody has any quick questions that they want to ask, we could give you guys a few minutes to do that. If not, we'll move on, but we'll wait for just a couple of minutes to see if anybody has any additional questions, okay? Let's give people another few minutes just to see. Okay, we do have a question. So the question is, statistically, have you met goals since using these methods, and what changes have you seen in the community?
So our goal generally was just to increase access to justice, and kind of what that data collection has looked like is speaking with tribal members and also examining tribal court outcomes. So we are seeing decreased recidivism, we are seeing decreased interaction with the criminal justice system. And then also we're seeing a lot of positive community output that you wouldn't necessarily see in a court case. So we're seeing more people have access to their birth certificate, more people have access to driver's licenses and things of that nature.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything additional. So I think if we could go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so we do have the contact information for both of our presenters here, as well as a QR code for our evaluation link. And we just want to say thank you all for attending today's webinar, Empowering Tribal Courts and Pro Se Criminal Defendants. And thank you again, Ilsa and Mary, and our partners at NIJA for joining us today. The webinar will be posted on walkingoncommonground.org. That will also be sent out to our mailing list. It will include both the recording as well as the PowerPoint and any additional resources. And we will again drop those links in the chat as well. And while everybody's taking a few minutes to fill out that evaluation, I did want to let everybody know that this webinar is part of a series of monthly webinars to support the development and enhancement of tribal courts, tribal judicial systems, and intergovernmental collaborations. These webinars are brought to you by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, the National American Indian Court Judges Association, and the Tribal Judicial Institute, UND School of Law. The next upcoming webinar will be titled Pretrial Release Hearings, Setting Bail and Conditions in Tribal Criminal Courts. And that will be on Wednesday, March 19th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Please save the date and we will send out more information soon, including a registration link for that. Again, as a reminder, there's a link for an evaluation in the chat box as well as the QR code. And we will give you a few minutes to complete those evaluations. And again, we thank you for your feedback. It's very useful for us. And we look forward to seeing you next month.